Okay. Is it Tony? Is it okay if I call you Tony or?
Please do.
Okay. Tony's with us, and I greatly appreciate your time. I just going back a little bit, when I was going through my legal woes, freshly indicted, I actually became aware of this case, Dawn's case, and it was extremely intriguing to me because of for multiple reasons. Um, what was happening with you was intriguing because it was very similar to these Cleveland cases, and then just the total lack of investigation of her death was very intriguing to me. And getting ready for this show, I didn't even honestly know. I was trying to get more material essentially so that I could intelligently speak with you, and I didn't even know that the other podcast I can't remember the other videocast channel was doing a series.
Seeking Justice.
Yeah, you guys were doing a series, and so I by no means am trying to step on anything they're doing. I'm not trying to compete with them, but I did notice that their subscriber rate is about the same subscriber as I have currently on this show. So I'm hoping that this maybe between both audiences, maybe we can get Dawn's message out a little louder, hopefully.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you. Thanks for having me on. Thank you for that, because the ladies at Seeking Justice want this story out, and they would be happy to be a guest on your show. And I did, by the way, mention to Ed and Karen Pasela, Dawn's folks, that I was going on your show. They say hello, and they also would be willing to talk to you. So if this is something your audience is interested in, and congrats, because that's a lot of subscribers in a pretty short amount of time, in my opinion. So good for you. And once you get to that 1,000, then it goes viral and you get more and more people. So I think you've done a lot of the grunt work to get, to build an audience. And so good for you, and congratulations on that.
Well, thank you. Well, I'm hoping I can give maybe a little more, I was obviously an active homicide investigator for some time for East Cleveland. I'm very familiar with death investigations, especially in Cuyahoga County, especially with working with the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office, which at this point, I can't remember if they were the coroner when this incident took place with Dawn. I can't remember if they were the coroner's office still, or if they had migrated over to the medical examiner's office at that point. But I had as a crime scene investigator, I had an actual plaque next to my desk, and it was a quote from Voltaire. And so I just wanted to share that. And his French philosophy was, to the living we owe respect, but to the dead we owe only the truth. And I took that very much to the heart, especially with a lot of cold cases that I would investigate. And so, and again, I don't want to touch on anything you don't want to speak on. This isn't that kind of show. I'm not trying to ambush you with anything. So if I ask something that you don't want to speak about, just feel free to let me know. Hey, I'm not comfortable answering that or whatever.
If everything's on the table, and I appreciate to be on your show, but I don't screw around. So you or your audience can, I'm open to questions, and there's nothing off limits. So wherever you want to take the show is fine. And if you want to start with the death scene in Dawn Pasela, we can even talk about that, right? To kick things off. It's up to you.
Okay. First, I sort of want to introduce you. I actually, again, was researching. You were obviously doing very well at one point. I saw an interview with you guys you did with the Crane magazine at some point. I don't know if you recall that or not. Can you give us a little background of
Sure. We'll start with Tony. Okay, so I'm from Cleveland. I have a big Italian Catholic family, and endless spaghetti dinners when I was a kid, and a loving family. Very fortunate. I was very lucky to go to Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I have an MBA. My friends will tell you I'm kind of a nerd. But my dream was always to be, to start a business here in Cleveland. That was what we wanted to do. And that's what we did. And yes, we had a successful business, but you never can get anywhere in business unless you have great colleagues. And so we were really fortunate because that's what builds a company. I mean, you have to have the right crew. And any organization, whether it's a basketball team or anything, you got to have we had great colleagues and built up a heck of a business right here in town. And we did property management and construction services and real estate auctions. And we basically built a business to help people either buy rental properties or just buy a home instead of paying rent. And in East Cleveland, that was a great example. We did projects there and on Elberon, and we could start rattling off, a cool, Mayfair and Strathmore and
Yeah.
Hayden and all kinds of streets in East Cleveland that I'm sure you know very well. And having investment capital and job creation in those communities was great. It was a shot in the arm for the residents that lived there, and it was stability and tax revenue, and we thought we were doing great things in town. And then lo and behold, the government destroyed everything I worked for my entire life. I'm accused in this televised raid of stealing $46 million. And so, we started very humbly in the basement of my house with 2 credit cards. I mean, the first thing we did was paint some lady's house for $400. So, I mean, we didn't exactly corner the market. But anyway, look, we built a business from scratch here in our hometown, and it was destroyed by the government for no reason. I was accused of owning a mortgage company, which it's ridiculous that these prosecutors didn't even know what businesses I owned. And man, there was a lot of enthusiasm to put us in prison prosecuting real estate agents.
So, and I'm sure you'll get into it, but one of the questions that I'm sort of foggy on at this point is, and I'm sure you'll bring up the name later, but Clover. Now,
Catherine
did she
Clover.
initially work for your business at some point, or?
Well, she was a real estate investor. Okay, so we were realtors. Okay, so when somebody comes into a real estate office, we're going to sell you a house if you're interested in buying a house. So I mean, basically, what happened was Clover was one of many investors that was interested in buying real estate. And if you remember, after 9/11, interest rates were low, and the government said, "Hey, keep shopping and let's keep America rolling and let's go buy real estate." And the interest rates are really low, and people could make a lot of money. So in business, there's 2 emotions sometimes: greed. Like, I want to get in. Scott's making money. I want to make money. He bought a house and sold a house, and I went to this cocktail party. So you want to not miss out. Get in. Well, why is everyone else making money except me? And then there's fear. So when things are tough, I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to risk my personal credit. I just want to keep my expenses down. I don't want to buy a new car. So we sort of have this pendulum going from one way or to the other. And our company started when the real estate market was tough, but Clover came along when things were booming, and she bought a bunch of properties. And then, she found out later, I guess she couldn't rent one of them. She paid somebody to burn the house down. And there was an arson investigation because the insurance carrier had paid off her mortgage and given her a big check for $100,000 or something. And they looked at the fire as very suspicious. And so initially she was going to be the focus of an investigation. And the ATF had, was interested in indicting her. Dan Caceres, now the senior assistant Ohio Attorney General, but at the time in the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office, thought Catherine Clover was hot. And he has a history of rescuing the damsels in distress. I could make your case go away. Don't worry about it. I'll tell the feds to knock it off. And, she was very fearful that she was going to go to prison. And he basically said, you can redeem yourself. He sends her to law school, CSU Law, then Marshall Law School, and has her working inside the prosecutor's office. And she's really a professional witness. She becomes his girlfriend. They have a 6+ year long affair. You can read his wife's Facebook messages on my website. You don't have to take my word for it. freeTonyViola.com. You can read his 600 pages of emails back and forth to Clover. And we've got statements from Clover's husband, who Caceres got rid of, putting in jail, and Clover's boyfriend after Dan Caceres. Anyway, so he starts this affair with this girl and says he's going to protect her. And she's going to be an informant in the fine tradition of Carmen Marino and some of the earlier prosecutors in Cuyahoga County. For some of the older folks might remember those names. But anyway, he's like, look, you build cases on informants. You're my informant. And then I was considered a bigger fish because I owned a business that many people have maybe heard of. So she told Caceres that when she was at the mortgage company getting all these houses, that Tony was there and told her it was okay to lie on the loans. So the government never did the logical thing, which would be, there's more than one guy named Tony, right? And so they never took the next step of investigating further. They kind of took her word for it. And there was a different guy. It was a different Tony, a guy named Tony Capuzzo, who owned a company called Family Title Services and was involved in supposedly unseemly transactions. And so she said Tony was there. So they said, well, aha, Tony's guilty. And so when then the company was raided, I was prosecuted in federal court and state court. I stole $46 million. It was supposedly the nation's largest mortgage fraud case. The prosecutor said, if you see Tony Viola at a Starbucks with his briefcase and coffee and a muffin, that is not breakfast. That is a crime scene. This is what they were saying. If your house went down in value, it's this Tony guy. I mean, with this little real estate company with like a coffee pot and a couple of whiteboards, how did we crash the economy? And then the absurdity of like I supposedly stole $46 million, and the banks never did anything about it. I mean, it's ridiculous. You miss your car payment, they're calling you, or you owe $50 on your credit card. They want the money. But I supposedly stole $46 million. And then there was no bond. They arrested me in federal court and state court. And they said, here, sign here and you can go home. I said, well, what is this? And they said, well, you have to promise to come to court. And I said, okay, I promise I'll come to court. So the whole thing just struck me as just absurd right from the beginning, that it was the nation's largest mortgage fraud case. I never did mortgages. I had nothing to do with mortgages. I didn't own family title services. The government didn't even know what businesses I owned. But once you get caught up in this, there's just no way out. The government never leaves you alone.
And that's one of the questions, and you just answered it. I mean, so you were essentially a realtor or property manager. You had nothing to do with mortgages whatsoever, as far as mortgage underwriting, anything like that. Just so everybody might not understand that there's a distinct difference between realtor and mortgage underwriter. And you weren't doing any of the mortgage stuff, correct? Or
Correct. I mean, we were a real estate brokerage, like Howard Hanna or Keller Williams, with the yard sign in the front yard. And so the answer is I never processed loans. I never originated loans. I never borrowed any money. Like usually mortgage fraud would be some guy that, lied and he bought an apartment building and he didn't really own assets, or he double pledged security, or there was instances of people making up properties that didn't exist. Hey, let's refinance some house that doesn't exist and we'll all carve up the money. So I'm a realtor. We're selling. What do you think is going to happen if you call a realtor? Hey, I want to buy a house. Great. When can we meet? We're going to go have a coffee and we're going to talk about it. So the government said that I stole millions of dollars from a mortgage company, which I didn't. So what was the easiest line of defense was, well, let's get the mortgage company computers. Let's get the computers that you seized. We went to all these companies and had all these raids. Let's go get the mortgage company computers. I'm not involved. I didn't get any money. I didn't do the loans. And so then the first thing that happens early on in the case is poof, the government says we lost the computers. Dan Caceres comes in. He's doing a case now in Toledo. It's the same nonsense for years. He comes in, he has his eyes down on the ground, sheepishly saying, Your Honor, this is a really complicated case and there's lots of documents and, we do have computers, but I don't know if we have all of them. We're looking, we need time. So Caceres and the federal guy, Mark Bennett, this shucks, we don't know where the evidence is. Now the government's supposed to be prepared you're supposed to have speedy trial rights. I mean, there's no such thing as rights when they come after you. You can forget about that. But just pretend you're in grade school learning about the Constitution or something. You're supposed to have speedy trial rights. The government is supposed to be able, kind of ready to present their case. So they investigated and said, there's a crime here. I mean, what's supposed to happen is the bank should have called and said, hey, we think we were defrauded. We lost $46 million. Or somebody calls the police. My God, somebody's been shot. Let's find out who did it. Here, they rushed to indict me. They didn't even know what companies I own. This is the federal government too, the U.S. attorney here. And they're so pompous about the rule of law and all this. So they indict me. They say I stole $46 million. They say I own companies I don't own. This is a fact. This is not an opinion. You could find out what companies somebody owns, right? So they don't really investigate the case at all. Really, in Cuyahoga County, to Mark Bennett and Dan Caceres, the indictment was an investigative tool, is actually what happened, because they actually were like learning about like who owned what company as this case was proceeding. It's ridiculous. So then they supposedly lost the computers, which drained me financially. I got to pay these lawyers. We got to go to court. We got hearings. And we have a statement from a guy named Nick Miles who says he gave them the computers and they told him, if you don't lie, this is a Cuyahoga County special, Dan Caceres and Mark Bennett said, if you don't lie and say you never gave us the computers, we're going to indict your wife. And the grand jury's in session right now. And, we'll get a quick indictment. And then I'll have foster care, whatever, family services pick up your kids and they'll be in foster care tonight. So what you had was they didn't know what businesses I owned. This thing was slapdash. And then, of course, they don't want to admit they're wrong. They don't want to dismiss the case after all this media raids and all this televised breaking news, Channel 19. So then they lock themselves into a false narrative, and then they start playing games. But yes, you're exactly right. You know, the Soviet Union in the 30s, they used to say, the Soviet Union secret police, show me the man and I'll show you the crime. I mean, that's what's actually happening. We're not actually, um, like having a crime and then investigation with these task forces set up. This is what's actually going. We're going after people. It's very frightening sometimes when these task forces are there to target people.
I mean, we talked briefly via email and a little bit before we started recording. I mean, it eerily matches what the prosecutor's office is doing right now in East Cleveland for the East Cleveland officers they've indicted. They've used that indictment, and I don't know if they just assumed everybody was going to plea, but I mean, they literally had no evidence. They had nothing in discovery, and just like you said, you're almost 2 years into it before they actually even start picking up the phone to talk to people. So normally, I got to be honest. Had I heard your story originally, I probably would have like thrown you to the wind and discerned it. But it happens. It happened to me. It's happening to 11 other East Cleveland officers right now. And you have a ton of evidence, which I think you briefly mentioned your website. I'll make sure that I put it up and post edit. You have a ton of evidence to support what you're saying. So I have no doubt whatsoever. And obviously, you've been adjudicated. I believe Kimberly Coral helped even get your final federal trial dismissed, correct?
Well, we're working on that. I mean, the FBI
Okay.
was lying about evidence. The federal prosecutor was fired, this guy Bennett. And we have Yale Law School and Kim Corral working together on this case. So, it hasn't been finally adjudicated, but we're a lot closer than we ever have been. And we're waiting on a ruling about evidence in my case that Yale Law School presented. So, the point is that we basically thought, well, why should that evidence locker? Why take my word for it? I don't want to tell people what to think. I just want to give you the facts, right? And that's what Dawn Pasela told me, by the way. And I know we're going to talk about her. Dawn was like, just give the facts. So and by the way, there's nothing better than quoting the source documents. So in other words, if Tony Viola says the FBI lied about evidence, most of your viewers are going to roll their eyes and say, oh yeah, sure. But when the FBI says they lied about it, I mean, according to the FBI, they were unaware of records in their own record system for 10 years. That's what they said. And then they released me from prison after a decade. They said they were unaware of their own records, not the task force, not in the county. I'm talking about the FBI's own records. So why would I say it? I like quoting them. I mean, Dan Caceres emailed Catherine Clover about massages and hand jobs and blow jobs. Why would I say it? It's better to quote them. I mean, Mark Bennett said that using perjured testimony to put me in jail and win the conviction was vital because without the perjured testimony, they couldn't win it. It, quote, jeopardized the outcome of the case. So it was, quote, in the interest of justice to use perjured testimony. I mean, the arrogance of these people is unbelievable. They actually, I mean, it's not constitutional to put an innocent person in prison based on perjured testimony. This is something long decided in a case called Napier by the Supreme Court, 70 years ago. This is not a question. It's a due process violation for prosecutors to knowingly use perjured testimony. But nobody does anything. Once these cases start, they take on a life of their own. And the other thing that happens too, now, of course, I was facing a lot of time and I would refuse to plead guilty, but there was a lot of people. I'd be sitting in that injustice center downtown, and, they would have these pre-trials and people would take a day off of work and, pay to park down there and sit there. And then someone would say, oh, it's been postponed. And there were people that pled guilty because they said, look, I'm drained. I can't afford a lawyer. I can't afford to miss work. My boss won't let me, I lost my job. I was charged with all this stuff. And so, it's an evil injustice factory down there, cranking them out, just cranking people out through this sausage factory down there. Nobody ever says, wait a minute, this is crazy. We don't have any evidence. And so this indict first. And that's the other thing that Dan Caceres does. And this is a common practice. We're going to indict you on 747 felonies. I was indicted as a racketeer. So selling real estate is a criminal activity. Getting a commission check is theft. Depositing the money into my checking account or the company's checking account is money laundering. Writing a commission check to our hardworking employee that sold the property is conversion. I mean, this is ridiculous. We're realtors, for God's sake. We're licensed realtors. The other thing, too, is not only did the bank not sue us or complain or say we stole money, but we passed all of our audits. And I had a lawyer that wrote all our paperwork. So, it's really amazing because We thought we were taking all these steps to be an honest company and complying with the rules and, finding out what the regulations were. And I still went to jail for 10 years. So, it's really show me the man and I'll show you the crime. And once these cases start, there's just no appetite to ever dismiss it, no matter what the evidence is. A lawyer told me once, if the prosecutors watched the video of what actually happened, it wouldn't matter. If it was the second coming of Christ and Jesus Almighty told them what happened, it doesn't matter. Once you get indicted, that's it. You can plead guilty or that's it.
So at some point, you sort of answered the question that I had in my mind. So Clover's incident started prior to you being, you were basically simultaneously indicted, right? Federally and by state. So Clover's incident was prior to you, obviously, because she.
Oh yeah, they were gonna go after her. Dawn Caceres has a history, and there's just all kinds. There's names I can name if you want, and if they want to sue me, they can. But basically starting when he was the law director in Norwalk, Ohio, right through today, of having sex with witnesses while they are testifying for the government in criminal cases, and nobody cares. I mean, it is absolute. And the one thing about Dawn Caceres and Mark Bennett, these two prosecutors, the federal guy who was fired and Caceres who's still prosecuting, they took no steps to hide any of their criminal activity. Okay, like as a police officer, you probably found that criminals would take some steps, right? I mean, they generally would try. I mean, they put stuff in writing. I mean, one of my attorneys, the pro bono of attorneys, was like, it's one thing to get a blowjob, but why would you put an email? Why would you put it in an email? And so Bennett says they're using false testimony to win. I mean, they're fabricating evidence. Dawn Caceres, they're actually talking about altering documents inside the prosecutor's office in writing. I mean, in writing. So Bennett and Caceres feel invincible. They feel they can do whatever they want. They lie. And that's the other thing too that's great about these prosecutors. If you litigate with them over a long period of time, not that I wanted to do this, my life's been destroyed by this for 15 years of this nonsense, but they lie. They'll say anything at a given moment. So Mark Bennett will say anything. So he would say, well, there's no voice recordings by Dawn Pasela. Then in another filing, a couple years later, he would say, well, we gave the recordings back to the county prosecutor. Well, I thought there were none. Or then he would say, like most recently, he threatened those ladies that were doing that YouTube investigative series. He said, well, as soon as I knew that Dawn Pasela was wearing a wire and making these recordings, I told the FBI to turn it over to the defense. And then I have defense lawyers that said, we never got any of this. We would have raised holy hell if we knew they were recording your trial preparation. So they lie so much and so frequently and in writing, which is great. So then you can literally make a grid of there are no tapes. We gave you the tapes. We don't know about the tapes. The FBI has the tapes. The tapes are returned to the prosecutor's office. So with all of these different aspects of my case, the prosecutors and why do they think that they get away with it? There's no accountability inside of this thing. That prosecutor's office needs an entire reboot. You need you got a clean house. You got to start fresh. There must be lawyers somewhere that we could rehire. Get rid of these people and start.
That is the total irony. I mean, working in law enforcement for the longest time, we had Cuyahoga County set up by regions. So East Cleveland, I believe, was Region 5 at that point. And you get to know your prosecutors. And prior to this even happening to me, I would never expect this to have occurred. You get to know your prosecutors. They're ethical people that law enforcement's working with. And then it honestly seems to be this economics unit, in my opinion, and higher, that seems to be very corruptible. I don't know what. I mean,
law enforcement. Yeah, let's talk about corruption real quick. Law enforcement should be focused on issues that affect public safety. If I stole millions of dollars from J.P. Morgan Chase and Citibank, the first thing that should happen is those entities are large enough to take care of themselves. They would have filed a civil suit. And if it rose to the issue of criminality, then law enforcement could get involved. But the fact is, this is a joke. This is a complete misuse and misallocation of resources because the realtors that are using paperwork that lawyers wrote, they said our paperwork was fraudulent. There's something called KBOR, the Cleveland Area Board of Realtors. They have standard forms. This is a vast conspiracy. Some of them were on the government's own website, the HUD website. We're using forms that the government says to use, and I'm supposed to go to jail. But let me give you some corruption. I mean, let's talk about Arvin Clark. I mean, he's at Ohio BCI. He's a triple dipper. He was a Cleveland policeman. He's getting all these different pensions. And Arvin gets outside income from the Ohio Attorney General. He got permission from the Attorney General's office to engage in outside income. So he was a security consultant for banks. Now, this is a conflict when you're heading up the mortgage fraud task force, because the same banks that he's saying me and 1,500 other people were indicted, we scammed these banks. He's got a financial conflict of interest because he's being paid by these same banks. He gives talks to banks. He teaches their employees. He walks around the bank branch and says, oh, let me show you. You should put another lock on that window. Well, if Arvin Clark wants to do that, great. He should not be involved when those same entities are portrayed as victims in criminal cases. It's ridiculous. I had him on the stand and I said, Arvin, if I paid you money, like if my real estate brokerage paid you money, could you create some report that said that, we were an honest company just selling properties and that any misconduct was the fault of these lenders that were engaged in reckless lending, then he wouldn't answer how much money he got paid by them. And I saw I have the whiteboard here. We want to put it on. So that was the second trial where I was acquitted. So, this is absolutely ridiculous. Dan Caceres' wife, Susan, is a realtor. He's involved in all these real estate transactions and he's prosecuting realtors. We were basically his wife's competitor, my company. So, what happens is you've got these blatant conflicts of interest. It's not like the appearance of a conflict. It's an actual conflict of interest, and nothing happens because we've got to, get these convictions, go through this meat grinder. And the other thing too is that people like me, I'm the perfect target for these prosecutors. First of all, they're not exactly afraid of me, right? I have no violence. I never got into a fight in my life. I never punched anybody. I'm a total nerd. And so they love these cases. They could interview secretaries and realtors and bring them to the office. This is a total joke. So, to have people sitting in an air-conditioned office going through mortgage documents and, oh, well, you signed this piece of paper, 10 years ago. Do you remember what this said? And look on line 74. This is ridiculous. But the thing is that this task force was set up and, there was a lot of interest in these cases. There was forfeiture. By the way, one other thing about corruption that is important. Well, two quick things on corruption in these financial fraud cases. First of all, the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office is not sending money to the stated victims in these cases. So they said we stole all this money from banks, and they're using it as a slush fund. I have the ledger. It's on my website. Cass Dan, which we assume is Dan Caceres, is getting paid. So the prosecutor's dipping into the crime victims fund, and the victims of the crime told the probation department and these pre-sentencing reports, we did not lose money. We are not asking for restitution. So these cases are absolutely fictitious. So there's this nonsense with these victims that aren't really victims, which defeats an element of the offense, which means everybody's innocent. And then the government has this $20 million pot of money that they're using for whatever. They're buying, there's hotels. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous that the government is a prosecution for profit scheme to put people in jail. And then listen, I still owe restitution because my first case is still being litigated. So if I don't pay the $50 every Friday or whatever, they could put me back in jail. When you're in prison, they're collecting money, $25. Do you really think JP Morgan Chase needs $25 from an indigent prisoner? They're waiting around. Oh, we can make payroll now. We just got Tony's check from the
Well, so it's at some point, is Dawn on the initial jurisdictional task force, or is she recruited at some point later?
No, the aforementioned Arvin Clark was teaching a class at Tri-C, and Dawn was one of her students. And Dawn had a interest in finance and business, and he said, you'd be great for our, we need economics, crime people that know something about business. So Dawn was extraordinarily talented, very bright young lady, and so they bring her in, and then all of a sudden she's appointed to this task force. Office manager position. And so she's cataloging all the evidence. And you probably know this from your experience. Dawn was doing something called deconfliction, where, there's all these different agencies. So if a policeman or a detective or somebody's going to interview somebody, they would call Dawn first and say, hey, has someone interviewed this guy? Oh, yeah, the FBI. Did you have the interview report? Yeah. So you'd want that before you talk to them. Or you would, hey, is this a cooperator? Is this person cooperating with us? Is this person a target? Has anyone talked to this person? Oh, yeah, he's cooperating with the state, gave him you want to know that before you ran out and conducted an interview. So Dawn had a very important job, and Kim Corral says that Dawn outsmarted these folks because she's a very, very attractive young lady and very smart, but they probably underestimated her and thought that she would be sort of a malleable or impressionable young lady. And Dawn was the kind of person who didn't take what you said as gospel. She would question things. So when the government said I stole $46 million, she started looking, well, where is this money? Or, he's on TV saying he doesn't own these companies. Does he really own the company or not? And she would question this stuff. She would look at the documents. Wait a minute, this person did a loan application. It says they're not putting any money down to buy this house. Well, how is Tony supposed to go to jail? So I think her initial curiosity was piqued, and then she just saw what was going on inside the office and was very disgusted that there was evidence being suppressed. And, she said to me once, she's like, look, I don't hate the police. I work in the law enforcement, but I just think court should be fair. I guess that's a stupid, naive thing. I just think if the government is supposed to turn over evidence to somebody, they should turn it over. By the way, what you said before, I'm with you, because I never would have believed this. I never had any interaction or experience with law enforcement ever, except seeing a police officer and I would say hello. I never had any criminal, nothing. I never even could imagine this stuff was actually going on. And so until you personally experience it, which sadly the government is really cranking it out, we're destroying lots of lives here. Until you personally experience it, you can't imagine it. And so to have reform, one thing you have to do is what you're doing, which is to make sure the public knows what's actually going on, because this has got to stop.
And it does. And I appreciate, like I said, I appreciate you coming on, because I think you're probably one of the strongest cases I've come up to at this point. You clearly have been railroaded. And again, I encourage everybody. I think you at some point I was going through, and I honestly wasn't able to get through all. You have, I think, 600 emails in your evidence locker, and I encourage everybody to go in and look for themselves. But you have probably the most evidence that you've been railroaded that I've ever seen from anybody, and so I agree. Someone has to understand, and I think people. They have this misconception that just because somebody's charged that they're guilty, and that's just not the case. And like you said, once you're charged, your reputation's ruined. My reputation was ruined. It then becomes financial. It becomes harder to actually fight for your liberty, your ability to stay out of prison.
Right. It's important to know that there is no such thing as the presumption of innocence. Okay. When I was accused, when Mark Bennett and Dan Caceres had these press conferences and said that I stole millions of dollars, we had companies that entrusted us to manage their apartment buildings or their office buildings or their houses. Okay. Now, if you owned properties and you saw on TV that I was indicted in federal court and state court and accused of stealing millions of dollars, you mean you're going to say, yeah, we trust this guy to go collect? They all fired me. They fired our company immediately. My colleagues said, Tony, I love you and I love working here, but I can't, I got my kids, I got to get soccer uniforms on Friday. I got a car payment due next Tuesday. I got to skedaddle. So we wish you the best. And so there's no such thing as presumption of innocence in a practical sense. I'm a police chief, but I'm indicted. I'm going to keep on my job. You can't. So the government in Cuyahoga County, they're very cavalier with indicting people as an investigative tool. We're just going to charge you with 700 felonies and then sort it out later. That is not appropriate. That is very wrong. And that's what they do down there. And it's complete bullying. It's unconstitutional. It's illegal. It's wrong. It's got to stop. And let me tell you about real quick on Dawn, just to close that loop. So she's at this task force. They're getting evidence in. It's all exculpatory to me, like these computers from these mortgage companies that I didn't get any money. And then there's really no fraud. Banks were making reckless and stupid loans. Okay. They were making loans to unqualified people. Is that good? No, I don't know if it's criminal. If you and I set up a business to hand out money on the street corner without really checking anything, I don't know that that's a crime. Maybe it is. But it's stupid. It's reckless. But why are you prosecuting the people that had nothing to do with it? That was the thing. If the banks were guilty of doing something wrong, they should have gone after those folks, and they didn't do it. So Dawn was absolutely apoplectic. Then they say, well, hey, listen, we got to put you on an undercover operation. And she's like, what? Now, this is not a undercover police officer or anyone with undercover experience. She's 23 years old at this time. And they said, you're going to hang out with Tony and you're going to start recording what their trial preparation is. You're going to pretend to be a paralegal working with defense lawyers. So you're going to tell them you want to share information. We'll give you some stuff. It's not that great, but something. And so they create this ridiculous undercover operation after I'm indicted for the purpose of, because Mark Bennett and Dan Caceres are too arrogant to throw the case out, and I would not plead guilty. So And I'm not saying I'm right. I'm not giving advice, but I said, I am not going to jail for 5 minutes voluntarily. I'd rather go there and die. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm not giving advice, but I'm like, look, I built the company. They're destroying my business, destroying my reputation. You just get to a point, like a squirrel's a really cute, nice animal, but corner it and see what happened. Like I've had it. I'm like, I'm not pleading guilty. I want an apology. This is ridiculous. I don't own these companies. And where's this $46 million? Anyway, so they create this like facetious undercover operation that Mark Bennett and Dan Caceres thinks a good idea to get my trial strategy. I mean, can you imagine if I bugged the U.S. Attorney's Office before trial? I mean, they would be whining. You could hear the pontification about this is an obstruction of justice and undermines the rule of law. But they did it to me. They bugged my conversations with my attorney after I'm indicted before trial, not for investigative reasons, but to get our trial strategy because this case sucked and I wouldn't plead guilty. And Mark Bennett says in writing that we're going to lose the case without perjured testimony and without this insight into our trial preparation. That's why I was convicted. This is crazy.
And just so everybody understands, what Tony's talking about is absolutely true. Prosecutors do this all the time, where they'll do subpoenas on phone records afterwards. After somebody's indicted, and the whole thing is trial strategy. And even if they legally can't introduce that evidence into court, that's not their premise. Their premise is to actually get as much strategy. If Tony were to say something that they didn't know about, they can use that, even though they may not be able to bring that directly into court. They can now start to go in. Oh, well, we didn't know. And I'm speaking very hypothetically here. If Tony had a bank account that they didn't know about and Tony starts talking about it, well, now they can start issuing subpoenas for that bank account. And it's just all trial strategy. And that's what Tony's talking about. And they actually had Dawn wired up, correct?
Right. They had her wired up. They